name is Alicia. Great. My name is Alicia Lozano. I am the Assistant Director of the Center for Biostatistics and Health Data Science, or CBHDS. We are academically housed in Virginia Tech's Department of Statistics and are actually physically located in Roanoke on the Health and Technology campus. Our center's director, Dr. Alex Hanlon, was very excited for today's talk and apologizes for not being here to kick us off. She's recovering from a medical procedure that was done earlier this week, and so I am here in her stead. Although I know that she's out here, I can see her picture out there listening in and hopefully cheering me on. So today's talk is part of our monthly seminar series supported by our multi-institutional NIH CTSA. And so our specific CTSA is called iThrive for the Integrated Translational Health Research Institute of Virginia. And our iThrive partner institutions include Virginia Tech, the University of Virginia, Carilion Clinic, and the Inova Health System. And please note that the session is being recorded so that it could later be accessed by our iThrive partners, including yourself. And your continued participation in the session indicates your consent to record. And please note that the Zoom recordings include audio, video, screen sharing, as well as the chat features. And just a little bit about iThrive. iThrive integrates data science methodology through all aspects of clinical translational research to speed discovery and improve the health of our communities. iThrive is committed to training the next generation of clinical translational researchers. And Alex Hanlon here at Virginia Tech and Sarah Radcliffe at UVA together co-direct the BIRD iThrive Research Methods Core. And for those of you that don't know, BIRD stands for Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Research Design. And the primary aim of our BIRD Research Methods Core is to provide comprehensive support in research design, conduct, and education. And so this slide here provides links to the various groups that provide iThrive consulting and collaboration services at the 4 iThrive partner institutions. So if you would like, you can take a screenshot if you have interest in collaborating with any of us, or you can also access this slide through the recording afterwards. And at Virginia Tech, we offer support through our center in Roanoke, CBHDS, and also through SAGE at Blacksburg. And we are very excited to have Dr. Morris with us today, and he has given many talks recently on the importance of the visibility and engagement of statisticians with the media and policymakers to ensure understanding of quantitative nuances and important societal level decisions, as well as dissemination of emerging pandemic-related scientific knowledge. And specifically, very recently, he was the keynote speaker of the Association of Clinical and Translational Statisticians, or ACSTAT 2021 annual meeting. And so the title of today's talk is COVID Data Science, Evaluating and Aggregating Emerging Knowledge in the Pandemic. So just a little background of Dr. Morris. He is a professor of biostatistics and also serves as the director of the Division of Biostatistics at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He received his PhD in statistics from Texas A&M University in 2001. His research interests focus on developing quantitative methods to extract knowledge from biomedical big data to patient outcomes and characteristics, using flexible automated regression methods, and to integrate that information across multiple types of multi-platform genomic, proteomic, imaging, and wearable device data to uncover biomedical insights contained in these complex data. He has done extensive applied work in cancer research, including constructing novel prognostic indices for hepatocellular carcinoma, and has helped develop and characterize molecular subtypes of colorectal cancer to discover new precision in therapeutic therapies. He has also authored a website and blog, coviddatascience.com, that represents his personal efforts to disseminate reliable and insightful information regarding the pandemic. And Dr. Morris is a fellow of the Institute for Mathematical Statistics and of the American Statistical Association, and has been recognized with various national honors. And just right before I hand this over to Dr. Morris, please note that our own Ian Crandall from CBHDS will be giving the October iThrive seminar. His talk will be on October 29th, again at 12 noon, and this will be on the topic of random forest. And just so that you know, we're going to try and save questions until the end of the session, but Kate Miller will be monitoring the questions and will stop if needed, but I think we'll try and leave questions to the very end. And with that, I will go ahead and pass the baton to you, Dr. Morris.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. Thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm excited to get to be with you virtually. I would love it if we were in a better place pandemic-wise where I could be visiting in person, but I guess we make do as we can. So I'm really glad that we can still do these things virtually. So what I'm going to talk about today, I really have kind of three main goals. One of my main big picture goals is to try and make the case for the fact that we quantitative scientists and biostatisticians specifically have important skill set that society needs. We need to be more engaged with policymakers and the media, so these quantitative nuances that trip them up, so we can help wade through that. So in the context of that, I'll talk a lot about my efforts during the pandemic, mainly through my COVID data science blog, what I've done with that. And then I'm going to go through some examples of things where, cases where I've seen some quantitative misunderstandings seemingly throwing off people, and explain kind of what I see in the data in some kind of crucial and timely issues, again, related to some of the blog posts that I've been doing lately. So in general, one thing that I think about in terms of quantitative science, I think is at the center of biomedical research, given the big data world that we live in. And so I think of biomedical data science as sort of an inclusive field that includes we biostatisticians and other quantitative scientists, that I think we play a central role. And I think statisticians play a key role within this general group because of our specific expertise in understanding variability, uncertainty quantification, our modeling tools, and our emphasis on experimental design and reproducibility of research. So I think we have a central role in many biomedical enterprises, and in particular during the pandemic. I think there's many aspects of what's been going on where statistical thinking is crucial to understand and process the information that is really accruing in real time, and decisions are having to be made with incomplete information in real time. So there's many different types of data floating around. They all have their nuances. There's measurement error, missing data, and other sources of bias that we kind of have an understanding of. We were adept at evaluating the strength of evidence. So when we see results come out, we can not just look at the results themselves, but quantify how much we can hang our hat on those results, or how much uncertainty there might be. Also, we understand the quantitative nuances, especially of observational data, of the confounding that sometimes people don't recognize and misinterpret some of the observational data and make poor decisions. Also, in our divided society, much of the information people get and process is filtered through their subjective biases, and especially politically. And many times the information gets caught up with different political narratives and other misinformation that goes around. And so I think we have the ability to look at the data clearly and see what the data say and try and cut through some of that bias. Also, our way of thinking and our modeling tools enable us to synthesize information across many different types of data to sort of uncover the common knowledge that they reveal. And also our ability to understand the nuances enables us to help with scientific communication, to communicate the results clearly, as well as their limitations and uncertainties, which is something that I think sometimes gets lost in translation when results get communicated to the media. So as I mentioned, I'm going to make the case that because of these skills that we have, we should be involved as much as we can and engage with the broader society. And so I'll talk about my blog page. And in particular, what I've tried to do in that is summarize what I see as the emerging evidence and misunderstandings that are producing confusion and division. And especially I focus on issues where it seems like a failure to understand or communicate the quantitative nuances is contributing to that confusion. And again, make a case for our greater visibility and engagement. And then I'm going to talk about several different topics of where I see the data, recent data pointing to in terms of vaccine safety, efficacy, durability, natural immunity, variants, and boosters. So I'll talk about some of those topics as time allows to show what I think the data seems to be saying. So, so going back to like, why am I doing this? Well, early in the pandemic, we're all in the same boat where all of a sudden there's this novel virus that is upending the world. There's all this uncertainty. We already see false information going out immediately. And so just as I looked at what was going on, I just tried to pass good information to my social media network, which is very diverse, from the most liberal to the most conservative, to people that are highly educated, not highly educated. And so as I passed that information on, people seemed to appreciate it and appreciate the perspective I brought. So that's what I decided to start this webpage as a way to provide sort of a potentially more impactful and more permanent venue for sifting through this information. So my goal with this is to use my perspective as a statistical data scientist to evaluate the constantly emerging information in the pandemic, filter out the biases, aggregate information together, identify key insights and their uncertainty, and then try and communicate them in an accessible and balanced way. And so I started in April of last year. So I have now 225 blog posts, and I've had over 600,000 unique visitors on many different topics. Some are brief commentaries, but then really in the last 6 months, I've done fewer blog posts, but made them deeper, almost like quick articles on key misunderstood or unappreciated topics. And some of them are focusing on debunking conspiracy theories or information from false experts. As we've seen many times, these can go viral and influence many millions of people who can't evaluate the veracity of these claims. So in some of these, I've tried to play my part in trying to objectively evaluate what these individuals say with respect, but pointing out the flaws in their thinking and the things I disagree with. Okay, so looking back early in the pandemic, early on, I think like many of the epidemics we've seen, here in the US, we didn't take it seriously. I think a lot of us thought it would blow over like other epidemics have. But then I think what changed this was a March 16th report by Imperial College, where they did some modeling and suggested that if left unconstrained, the virus would affect 80% of the USA and kill 2.2 million Americans. And I think that really woke many up to the seriousness of the pandemic and motivated the spring 2020 lockdowns in the US. And given that the virus was already widespread, containment was considered infeasible. So they kind of introduced this concept of flatten the curve to try and slow down the spread so the hospital systems would not be overwhelmed, as we saw in New York City and Italy. And so after like a month or so, the question was, how long do we keep these in place? And so this is one of the things that sparked me starting this pandemic, because I saw this roadmap that was done by this group at Harvard University that was claiming for near universal testing. They were saying that we couldn't really start reopening until we have 5 million tests per day in the US, and we couldn't fully reopen until we had 20 million tests per day, which if you think about that, that's basically testing every person in the US every 2 weeks. So when I saw this, I realized this is basically suggesting indefinite lockdowns. We were only doing 200,000 tests a day in April. there was major testing shortage. We've never done actually more than 2 million tests per day in the country ever. So I realized this was unrealistic and unnecessary, and also was underestimating the downsides and the collateral damage of keeping lockdowns in place indefinitely. So I wrote an op-ed for Philadelphia Inquirer on this because I saw in the data there was information from the literature emerging about how it's spreading and what were some targeted mitigation strategies that could yield most of the benefit of lockdowns, but with far less collateral damage. So some of my early blog posts were dealing with the emerging evidence of how it was spreading and how the different mitigation worked. But it also kind of showed me one extreme in this pandemic that I've seen that I would call alarmism, of people that just feel like the goal needs to be to eliminate COVID and do everything we can to prevent infections. But if it's let to go to the extreme, it's really not a very productive mindset. So this sort of colored sort of my big picture and what I saw going on in people's views of the pandemic. And so one of the key themes of the blog is kind of these two extreme viewpoints that I see in society and that affects how people process the information they see. So the one is alarmism, safetyism. At the other extreme is denial and doubt. So on the denial and doubt side, this group, people at the far extreme there, will many times not really believe in the virus. They'll think it's just a flu or it's a hoax, that it's overblown. They underestimate the viral transmissibility. They underestimate the danger. They tend to oppose any mitigation strategies. People at this extreme also tend to downplay the effectiveness of the vaccines, and they overplay the risks. But this group does see some things clearly, perhaps, where they are concerned about collateral damage from mitigation, which is an important factor. They acknowledge the death risk. There's a death risk disparity by age and health. They also acknowledge that recovery from infection does provide immune protection. And their perspective is really driven by individual and personal liberty. Then at the far other extreme, they rightfully are aware of the danger of unconstrained spread. They understand this virus is more transmissible and damaging than the flu. They acknowledge that the vaccine has an effect. They might underplay actually some of the risks of the vaccine. But this group favors stronger mitigation, downplays the collateral damage of some of the mitigation strategies, and maybe overestimates the effectiveness of it. And some people at this extreme might be practicing what you call safetyism, where they overestimate the ability to control the virus, and they may be pushing for something that's unrealistic and in the end damaging. So I think this group also downplays the immune protection after recovery from infection, and they tend to be intolerant and disrespectful of any viewpoints that start wandering towards the other end of the spectrum. And so people at this end focus on an emphasis on society and public safety. And so one thing I see is that, I've kind of battled with people at both ends of the extreme, honestly, more on the denial and doubt side, but I see that both extremes selectively ignore some of the information that is accruing. There's confirmation bias. And one thing I think is crucial is to consider all the evidence objectively. And that tends to lead to middle ground between these extremes. And I think we've done an exceptionally poor job of that as a society because of our divisiveness. There's a lack of respect, a lack of common ground, and a lack of productive discourse between people on different ends of the political spectrum, as well as this spectrum, that I think has been part of the reason why, in spite of all our resources, our management of this crisis has been really abysmal in the US. And so in the context of this, I think statistical data scientists like us can serve an important role to try and be objective arbiters of what the data say, to try and figure out what is true and avoid getting sucked into the extremes of these arguments. So that's kind of the theme of what I've been trying to do with this blog. And I did a blog post back last July where I sort of tried to convey this point. I tried to do an op-ed on this, but I couldn't get it published because none of the papers wanted to acknowledge that the denial doubt side had any sense of credibility or anything that they thought that was strong, and that this other side had anything wrong with it. So I could never get it published. But again, I think that's somewhat indicative of the divisiveness that we have. So now I'm going to hit on a couple issues where I think Statistical nuances have thrown things off, and there's been misinformation. So one of the problems is vaccine safety. And this has really been in the news coming out of the FDA meeting on boosters last week, which I'll mention briefly. But are vaccines safe? Well, after the vaccines started being dispersed in late December, early January, we started seeing these reports of deaths, like at nursing homes, after being given the vaccine. And this raised a lot of concern, and people started posting anecdotes that, okay, are these safe? Well, one thing that surprisingly people didn't look at is we had a nice randomized phase 3 trial that we could look at compared to placebo. And when you look at that trial, it showed that the serious adverse event rates were similar in the placebo to the vaccine, which is why they determined it was safe enough to do the emergency use agreement. But people sort of seem to forget that. But there are limitations to that because the study was only 30,000 patients. And so any rare serious adverse events, less than like 1 out of 1,000, or especially less than 1 out of 10,000, there was no statistical power to detect it. So there could still be some serious adverse events in some small subgroups of people, or that were rare, that were missed by the clinical trial and could be dangerous when you're talking about vaccinating a healthy population. And for this reason, there's post-approval safety monitoring is required for all drugs and vaccines by the FDA. And they have different systems. They have passive monitoring systems that people can report to, vSafe, which is a text prompting system, and then VAERS, where people can upload reports online. And then there's also active monitoring systems through electronic medical records and hospital systems. But the key thing is VAERS has come into the vernacular, and by the vaccine safety alarmists, this has been a favorite tool for raising alarm about vaccine safety. So this gathers serious adverse events, and they're posted on the web, and anyone can get reports. So this was just after a couple months, there were 1,700 deaths reported from the vaccine. So this contributed to the sense of alarm in a lot of people that, oh no, are the vaccines killing people? But there's many limitations of VAERS. One of them is these are not causal events. These are events that are reported after vaccination that might just be background events that would have happened anyway. And causality is not proven. And so if you think about deaths for a moment, in the US, there's about 3 million deaths per year, which is about 7,500 a day, 50,000 a week. So if you think about this, if you vaccinate the population, if you vaccinate half of the population, you're going to expect about 4,000 of them to die by random chance, but the day of vaccination, perhaps, if you just think of it as a random time of vaccine, and 25,000 deaths the week of vaccination is not unusual. And you can compute these type of background rates more rigorously, but people that look at VAERS and consider all of the events causal are naturally going to be alarmed, but you have to consider the background rate. And again, we know this as statisticians because you're giving this to hundreds of millions of people, and crazy medical things happen to people all the time, every day. And sometimes it's going to happen after vaccination. So you have to sort through that. And that's why there's these active monitoring systems that the FDA has in place to check up on these things. And so this system, so VAERS is really supposed to be there to identify safety signals, to look for things that might be higher than you'd expect. But then these active systems and other studies are there to verify the hypotheses generated from VAERS. But the problem is a lot of people are doing research on VAERS, making assumptions that may not be scientifically sound, may not quote unquote. And this is leading to, I think, a lot of the confusion and a lot of the stress. Now, there's also countries with centralized electronic medical records like Israel, Canada, the UK that can do population level rigorous studies. And I had been calling for this for a long time, and I saw there was a nice study out of Israel that was looking in detail at the safety, doing a matched case control design across the entire population. So hopefully there's more of these studies that can give more detailed information to figure out if there's any other cases of minority harm that could happen rarely, but with danger for some people. And if there's not more than what we already have learned, then hopefully it can reassure the public. And so I wrote a blog post back in June. This guy, Steve Kirsch, is an entrepreneur and now philanthropist who has gotten really heavily involved in pushing this idea that the vaccines are deadly. He's recently said that vaccines have killed 150 to 200,000 Americans, and he's pushing this idea. And so he had done a YouTube video with Brett Weinstein back in the summer that got 2 million views within a week. So I wrote this blog post to respond to his written claims that I didn't consider scientifically sound. So it kind of blew up and kind of upset him. But this is one of the sort of debunking posts that I had done. But interestingly, he spoke for 3 minutes at the open mic session of the FDA report or the FDA meeting looking at boosters last week, and claimed that 2 people were being killed by the vaccine for every one saved, using his logic that 150,000 have been killed by the vaccines. And so the expose, which is sort of a pseudo news source in the UK, publicized it like this: FDA experts revealed that the vaccines kill at least 2 for every life saved. So this has kind of gone viral, but this was actually referring to Steve's response. So I'm writing a blog post right now that is picking apart this claim. And, credit to Steve that in his slides, he actually gives the specific information to reproduce how he gets this number. But the assumptions he's making, I think, are extremely flawed. So I'm going to write a blog post to sort of point that out. But again, this is an example of, if you look at this blog post, if you look later in the weekend when it comes out, again, the statistical assumptions that he's making, the way he's thinking of causal inference and observational data, is what is leading him to these erroneous conclusions that literally millions of people are being confused by. Okay, so another source of confusion in the pandemic is, what are the vaccines doing? Are the vaccines really protecting against infection, or are they only treating symptoms? Again, this is one of the favorite criticisms of sort of vaccine skeptical or vaccine hesitant people, is, the vaccines aren't protecting infection anyway. It's more like just a treatment. It's just treating symptoms. So why are people saying that? And is that true? Well, the vaccine efficacy number that was used in all the phase 3 trials is basically the relative reduction of infections from placebo to vaccine. So it's this relative rate reduction. And because of the limitation of testing availability and the logistics of doing studies with tens of millions or tens of thousands of people, they didn't do weekly asymptomatic testing. They only tested when people reported symptoms. So because of that, the efficacy numbers are really only looking at % reduction of symptomatic cases. It did not look at asymptomatic cases. So for this reason, they needed to have a disclaimer: we do not know whether the vaccines reduce infection or transmission, because it wasn't proven in the trial. But unfortunately, people reverse that and say, oh, well, the companies admit vaccines don't prevent infections. They only reduce symptoms. So what they're doing is a sleight of hand that we statisticians are familiar with, to just say that we cannot prove, we cannot reject that null hypothesis, doesn't mean the same as we know the null hypothesis is true. So this is the logical thinking that threw people off. But we knew very early, right after these results came out, it must be protecting against infection. Because if we're reducing symptomatic cases by 95%, the only way it's not protecting against infection is if it's converting all of those into asymptomatic cases, if there was really the same number of cases or infections. But we have enough data to know that the percentage of asymptomatic cases was not going up. It was actually going down. And even if it wasn't going down, even if asymptomatic cases were the same, there would still be the vaccine-prevented infection. So it was very clear logically that it must be preventing infections to some degree, even though you couldn't say anything rigorously about the asymptomatic cases. But that way of thinking completely threw people off, and again, caused a lot of the confusion that continues to this day and just wears me out when I keep seeing this. And there were 13 cohort studies. This was as of May, validating protection against infection. It was 80 to 90% effective. Now, I'll talk a little bit about waning immune protection in Delta later, this number has come down, but even coming down with waning immunity and with Delta, it's still pretty clear that this number is 50 or 60%. So even still, the vaccines are preventing infections and reducing transmission. That's another issue I won't get into, but again, I think our careful statistical thinking is key in understanding this. Okay, and also there's this guy, Peter Doshi, who's on the editorial board for British Medical Journal. He's been writing some editorial pieces that are slamming the vaccines, and because he's in a kind of a position of authority there, he's had a lot of influence. But he's making some claims that really don't hold water, again, somewhat relating to this. So I wrote a blog post trying to critique some of the things that he was saying as well. Okay, so the first two things I mentioned then are really bits of confusion that come maybe from the doubt or denier side. But there's also problems sort of even among our scientific establishment in acknowledging some of the data. And this involves reinfections and immune protection after recovery. We seem to have a tremendous blind spot in this country about this. So the question is, how long after recovery from infection does immune protection last? In late summer of 2020, we saw anecdotal reports confirming that there were reinfections of new infections that were sequenced to be different. So it showed us that immune protection did not last forever. And at the same time, this paper came out in particular, as well as a couple others, in New England Journal of Medicine, following 34 subjects at 2 time points and showing that the antibodies sharply declined between those 2 time points. And what they did there was they extrapolated those 2 points linearly and suggested that all of the immune protection will be gone within 2 months. And some other papers also picked up on this. So this sort of created this mania of, oh no, our immune protection does not barely last at all. And then this coincided with some political happenings. Right around then, Scott Atlas, who was hired as a White House advisor to Trump, and this group of epidemiologists and others pushed this idea of the Great Barrington Declaration that suggested that we should just let the virus spread, just protect the vulnerable, let everybody else quickly get it so we can get herd immunity and get it over with. And so this is a dangerous idea that rightfully was criticized. And Scott Atlas was a proponent of this coming into the White House. So all of this information was very convenient for people to use to shoot down this erroneous idea. But I think what happened is people got in such the habit of using that argument, they didn't pay attention to the data. So first of all, it was clear that reinfections couldn't be that common. But then if we look through October, November, December, and into this year, paper after paper showed immune protection and antibodies lasting 4 months, 8 months, 12 months, all of the other different markers. And seeing that actually in a vast majority of the people, even after a year, they still have strong antibody levels that are still detectable, and also other immune markers that were protecting them. And then there were several studies that have come out now looking at how protected are previously infected people against reinfection. And all of these showed, one of them only showed 80%, but the rest of them were all above 90% reduced risk. So this is comparable to the protection of vaccines. And there's someone who just put out a medRxiv paper doing a review of 5 of these papers and a meta-analysis. It was reviewed pretty carefully, but the bottom line is that it is very clear in the literature that there is strong protection against reinfection. And now that we've seen waning effectiveness in the vaccine after 6 months, you know, it's possibly even a little more durable, or it's at least equivalent. Now, this is acknowledged in the EU and Israel. In Israel, they didn't initially even vaccinate people that were previously infected. And then they only made it optional and only gave them 1 dose. And in those places where they have immunity passports and mandates, if you were previously infected, that counts as immunity, even if you're not vaccinated. But in our country, we have not acknowledged that. Now, data does show that if you're previously infected and get vaccinated, it will boost your immune protection, cut your risk of reinfection in half. And all you need is really the first dose. There's a number of papers that now show this, and there's a number of immunological studies that show this. However, even without that vaccine, your protection is still right there. And so this is something that I think is a tremendous blind spot in our scientific establishment, and something we're really getting wrong. Okay, so I have a blog post sort of back in April pointing this out, and there's a lot more data that has come since then. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the variants, because this has really been driving how the pandemic has shifted this year, and I think it's going to continue to shape what is to come, and it's a little unpredictable. And so looking at variants, I think there's also a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding and alarmism about variants that the data sort of sets to rest if you look at it. So one thing is that viruses are always mutating and evolving and producing new variants. That's why we have to update influenza shots and why they have low efficacy. Now, the good thing about SARS-CoV-2 relative to influenza is that it has much less genetic diversity. It's only been around a couple years rather than tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of years, as influenza has been, at least in humans. And it does tend to have a slower mutation rate, but still, it will still evolve and variants will still emerge, especially under some circumstances. And most mutations are docile, but sometimes there's a mutation that gives it an advantage for spread, for severity of disease, or immune escape that enables it to take off. So as the pandemic has gone, there's better sequencing efforts to track the emergence of variants. And this one nice one here, next strain, is very nice, and they show phylogenetic trees, and there's others as well. And so you can kind of see the variants that emerge. So this here is Delta, this one here is Alpha. And so as we look how these variants have emerged, some of the things we're worried about is enhanced transmissibility and immune escape, where if we have mutations that overcome the immune response from previous infection and vaccines, our worry is that could send us back to square one, where we don't have population immune protection anymore. So people are really worried about immune escape. But to date, the immune escape hasn't really been what's driven the natural selection. It's more the transmission. So if you look, the original Wuhan strain was actually very quickly supplanted by this D614G that first emerged in northern Italy and kind of came to the US through New York. And that really drove the pandemic in the US in the early days. And it was a bit more transmissible than the Wuhan virus. Then once Alpha emerged in the UK in the late fall, this was 50% more transmissible than the previous strains. So everywhere it went, pretty much, it took over and dominated and pushed out almost all the other variants. Then when Delta emerged in India in the winter, this is another 50% more transmissible than Alpha. So it's more than 2.5 times more transmissible than the original Wuhan strain. And this has completely dominated everywhere it's gone. Now there's some other variants, Beta, which started in South Africa, Gamma that started in Brazil, and then Mu, which is a more recent one. And there's some others that have more escape potential than these, but these haven't dominated. It's been the transmissibility that's dominated. And the Alpha and Delta have very mild immune escape properties, but not very high. So when we have a new variant and people are worried about immune escape, how can we evaluate whether we should be worried or not? Well, there's this very nice paper that did some mathematical modeling, and they fit smooth curves to the protective efficacy of vaccines relative to laboratory measurements of the neutralizing antibody levels of that vaccine relative to convalescent plasma. So for each of the major vaccines, they plotted the efficacy from their trials against the neutralizing titer relative to convalescent plasma. And they found this nice nonlinear relationship that fit very, very well to the data. So I love using this as a tool, because then when we have a new variant emerge, like here we can look at we have a new variant emerge. As soon as they have laboratory values of neutralizing antibody levels, we can use this curve to predict how much efficacy will be lost in the vaccine. So for example, the Beta is the immune escape variant, the worst one we've seen to date, that came out of South Africa. And so that one showed an 8-fold reduction of neutralizing antibodies. if you have 1/8 of the neutralizing antibodies, it sounds like the vaccine is not going to work anymore. But if you look at what an 8-fold reduction from the very high levels that these mRNA vaccines produce, it would predict that the efficacy should go down to about 75%. And indeed, a study in Qatar found against beta, the Pfizer had 75% of efficacy. For Delta, we've seen a 3-fold reduction of neutralizing antibodies. That sounds really bad. That's a little bit of immune escape, but that really doesn't make a huge impact in the vaccine effectiveness. It would predict that Pfizer should be down around 85 to 90% instead of the original 95 in idealized against symptomatic disease, that is. And a study in the UK found 88% effectiveness in the population for Delta. So this is a very nice paper that I think is nice to refer to, and again shows how mathematical statistical modeling can really help gain information. So one thing I've seen though is people misinterpreting vaccine effectiveness data, especially as high proportions of the population have become vaccinated. Naturally, there's more breakthrough infections that we see. And so various social media and media reports started noting how many infections or hospitalizations were in the fully vaccinated. And these summaries created narratives that the vaccines were not working. So here is one saying nearly 60% of hospitalized COVID patients in Israel are fully vaccinated. So that makes it sound like the vaccines aren't working. And indeed, if you look here, I downloaded some data from the Ministry of Health website in Israel on August 15th. So this data contained all currently active cases as of August 15th, split out by vaccination status and also age, young or old. And when you look at this, indeed, 60% of the serious cases at that time were in fully vaccinated people. So this sounds like the vaccines don't work, right? Well, of course, we know as statisticians that looking at the raw numbers could be misleading, because if a lot of the population is vaccinated, of course, a lot of the cases are going to be vaccinated. Like if 100% of the people are vaccinated, then all the cases would be in vaccinated people because the vaccines aren't perfect. So of course, we have to normalize this. And this is what is typically done, that if you know the number who are vaccinated and not vaccinated in the population, which the Ministry of Health had this data, then you can compute the rate. So the rate per 100,000. And these numbers are for everybody 12 years or older in Israel in the country, because under 12 is not eligible for vaccines yet. So when you see this, you see a 3-to-1 ratio where indeed, the proportion is less for vaccination. That shows it's working. But if you compute effectiveness from this would only give a 67.5% effectiveness, which is not that high when we had an efficacy of 95%, in the clinical trial. However, when we look here, if you split it out by younger and older, note that 90% of the older people were vaccinated. And if you look at the 1.3 million unvaccinated, 90% of those were younger. We know that older people have a much higher risk of severe disease if they get infected with a respiratory virus. Okay, so on the basis of this, they did have this data that we could split it out. And indeed, look, 30 times higher rate of serious disease in the older 50 than younger 50. And because of the older people being more vaccinated, this produces a distorted view. So if we look here, if we look within each age group and we compute the vaccine effectiveness, we see 92% vaccine effectiveness based on this data here for the younger group and 85% for the older group. And if you look, all these numbers add up. So how can this happen that the younger and the older are 85 to 90%, but the overall is 67.5%? Well, we know in statistics, this is an example of what's called Simpson's paradox, because we have a confounder, which in this case is age, that is strongly associated with the exposure vaccination status and the outcome risk of severe disease. And this produces a very severe effect that attenuates the overall estimate. And so I did a blog post on this, and this is the one I had that really went viral. It quickly got more than 500,000 downloads and got millions of views on Twitter and appeared on newspapers, in a bunch of major newspapers in the world. So it really made a big stir. Even Mark Cuban even retweeted this. So I felt like that was pretty cool. But I think this is a really good example of something we know well in statistics that the public does not. And it shows the risk of people just looking at things like numbers and what percent are hospitalized or vaccinated, how misleading those numbers are, and how we need to consider confounding factors when we're thinking of whether the vaccines are working or not. And I've done a couple blog posts since then. There was another example here where I downloaded the Israeli data for a whole month. So now this is not just a snapshot, but this is from August to September, all daily COVID-19 deaths. And again, we see a similar thing here. Now, what's interesting here is that this was after the boosters came out, especially for the older group. So we have the number of total deaths in the unvaccinated, the vaccinated, and the booster group. Again, if you just look at the raw numbers, you would think things are not working. And actually, if you normalize, if you compute the effectiveness of the booster or vaccination without booster versus death, you only get 13.7%. So even if you normalize, it looks like it's not working. But if you split things out by age, the disparity in the risk of death is even more extreme for death than it is for severe disease. And then if we look at boosters, of course, most of the people getting boosters are the older people, and most of the people unvaccinated are the younger people. It's the same thing. So if we compute this, if we compute the effectiveness here in the young and the old group, you see that it's not 13.7%, it's much better. But this younger group, in this case, includes all of the kids. Well, the kids can't be vaccinated. The kids have almost no risk of dying. None have died in that time frame. So if you pull out the children and you look at the younger group excluding the children actually shows 90% effectiveness. And this is even after Delta. This is after waning immunity. We still see some strong effectiveness protecting versus death. So, and then here we can see the booster really improves things. We do see it's a little bit lower in the older group. And we see in data, it is true that the effectiveness in the older group, after about 6 months, it does tend to wane, and the boosters do restore it. But one thing I question is whether it's needed for the younger people. I haven't seen any data to support that. Unfortunately, I think the FDA made the right decision last week in making boosters available for the older group, but not across the whole country. I'm not sure the data is there yet that it's necessary. But again, another example. Now I'll show one last example, because Simpson's paradox doesn't just attenuate vaccine effectiveness, it can actually inflate it. And I don't know if you heard in the spring, some reports even coming out of the CDC and from the media saying, claiming 98, 97, 99% effectiveness in preventing infection, saying, oh, all the hospitalizations are from unvaccinated. And it sort of led a lot of people to overstating the protection of the vaccines and saying, oh, this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. But it created an unrealistic expectation that the vaccine was protecting everything. And I think that's created a big backlash. But I had a blog post I put up last week that's based on, that shows hypothetically how time confounding would severely inflate your effectiveness estimates if you naively computed them cumulatively for the whole year. So I'll illustrate this here. So these are real data for the US. The percent vaccination in the whole country from January to August, month by month. And then these are the estimated numbers just based on population of 330 million, which is about what our population is. These are the real monthly cases of COVID across the country. And so here I plot this. So you can see that in January, when the vaccination was just starting, we were having a really high winter surge where there were high case numbers. These case numbers came down a lot as the vaccination ramped up. Now, vaccines played some role in that, but because we were at the peak of the biggest surge we've had in the pandemic, that was wintertime, it was going to naturally come down anyway. And so this could produce some distortion. Now, unfortunately, they don't have enough data to compute this for real. So I had to throw in a hypothetical. So I took the real vaccination and case numbers in the US, but then I threw in a hypothetical vaccine effectiveness rate of 90%. In preventing confirmed cases For every month, it's 90%. So I took that data and split out what the number of vaccinated and unvaccinated cases would be to give a 90% for each month. So again, this is hypothetical, but we know it's 90%. So if you compute it in the different time strata, you get 90%. But what if I assessed it cumulatively? What if at the end of February, I looked at the effectiveness cumulatively across the year, and then in March, and then in April? You can easily see if you compute it there's your effectiveness estimates. So you would say that the vaccine effectiveness was 97, 98% throughout the spring, even though by construction, it was 90%. So this is again because of a Simpson's paradox effect going in the other direction. So what we have going on here is that the exposure of vaccination increases over time. The outcome of infection rate decreases over time, because at the population level, we were coming off a surge. Because it's going in different directions, the Simpson's paradox actually inflates these estimates and is responsible for exaggerating it. And what's even worse is if you were silly and just said, oh, this percent of cases are unvaccinated. Well, when you're reporting those numbers, including January, when almost no one was vaccinated, and when there were tons of cases, of course you get these crazy high numbers. And this is what we were reporting all spring, and creating some impression that the vaccines were stopping everything. But it was just a silly mistake that people were making, overlooking something that we understand as statisticians and creating this artificial expectations that once they fall through, then there's a backlash and people think the vaccines aren't working. So one thing I want to mention here is a little bit about Delta and a little bit about the waning immunity, just to kind of finish this issue here. So the emergence of the Delta variant really reignited the pandemic. Actually, I would say, based on the data and the quantitative aspects, if Delta would not have emerged, if Alpha is the worst we had, I think the pandemic would be under control in the US right now. I think Delta is the reason why things have gotten out of control. And the reason for that is the specific characteristics of Delta raise special challenges. First of all, there is mild immune escape, 2 to 3-fold reduction of neutralizing antibodies. But as I showed in that curve, that doesn't make a big difference, really, a huge difference by itself. But there's greater transmissibility. It's 2 to 2.5 times more transmissible than the virus that we saw last year. And mathematically, if you model exponential growth, if you multiply the exponent by 2 to 2.5, what does that do to the growth? And then even if you have mitigation that reduces things by 50%, you still are back to where you were last year. So this has been the main reason why Delta has caused things to reignite and cause lots of problems. Also, because Delta presents with a higher viral load and it reproduces faster in the body, this also enables it to produce more cases, especially asymptomatic cases in vaccinated people, because the vaccines don't block the virus. They just cause your body's immune system to neutralize it more quickly. But when the virus comes with a higher viral load and replicates more quickly, the virus is moving faster. And even if you have an effective immune response from the vaccine, it might not be fast enough to completely prevent positive PCR tests and cases, symptomatic cases. And for some people, it might not be enough to prevent severe disease. So that's why we're seeing these breakthrough cases. And Delta is a big part of that. So this leads to rapid surges. And studies have shown reduced vaccine effectiveness versus infection in Delta. And I'll skip that for the sake of time, but there's a bunch of papers. And so people that I say, oh, well, look at last year, our cases are really high right now, like last year. That shows the vaccines aren't working. But when we have a virus that is twice or more transmissible, what would these surges have looked like last year when our population immune protection was 10 to 15% instead of 75 to 80%? And I can confidently say that based on what we know about Delta, it would have been something we've never seen before in terms of crazy fast growth and overwhelming healthcare system. But people have trouble understanding that counterfactual. They just look at the raw numbers, compare them, and draw naive conclusions. Okay, so what about waning effectiveness? Are the vaccines losing their juice? One thing is, it's difficult to disentangle this, because if we look at the people that were vaccinated back in January in Israel, this is the one group of people that has driven all of this conclusion that effectiveness wanes. And in January, they vaccinated all of the older sick people and the essential workers that are going to have high exposure rate and high testing. So it's hard to disentangle all of these confounded factors. So when the people vaccinated in June have lower effectiveness, is it because of Delta? Is it because the vaccines are not working anymore? Or is it because the people vaccinated earlier are older, sicker people that were more immune compromised and people that were tested more? So that's a hard question. It's a causal inference question. Again, it requires careful analysis. So the Israeli Minister of Health had press releases mentioning the effectiveness for those vaccinated in July decreasing to 64, then 39, then 17%. So these press releases created the impression that waning immunity meant after 6 months, the effect is gone. But is that true? Well, there were very well done studies, 3 of them with these same Israeli data, and here's one in the US, and I think there's been one done in the UK now, that looked rigorously at time since vaccination. They adjusted and stratified by age, by time, by pre-existing conditions, by all the factors that they could. Not all of them, but many of the most important ones. And they found indeed there's evidence of waning immunity, but it wasn't completely gone. It was down by like maybe 1.5 to 2-fold decrease, maybe 2.5-fold decrease at the most. So what does that mean? Well, this Goldberg paper included unvaccinated people as a reference. The others did not. And so what is it? They found 1.6 to 1.8-fold higher risk of breakthrough infection if you were vaccinated in January relative to vaccinated later in April or May. And so after adjusting for the confounding factors, what that shows is that people that were recently vaccinated were still 75 to 80% protected against infection. That's symptomatic or asymptomatic. The people vaccinated in January were down to 50 to 65%. And that indeed is almost a 2-fold increase of risk. But this is not down to 0% or 17%, unlike the impression. So the careful modeling, they've used the type of tools that we know are cutting edge for trying to get at the sense of causal inference and observational data and try and adjust for these confounders. And they found that, yes, the immunity is waning, but it's not down to 0. It's still quite strong. And it could be that a lot of these are the immunocompromised people or the older people. That hasn't really been parsed out yet. In terms of severe disease, they also showed a similar waning of effectiveness, but the effectiveness went from 91% to still 86%. And in the younger groups, it still seems like it hasn't waned too much at all. So that's why the boosters have definitely helped restore that effectiveness. But the question is, are they really necessary for severe disease for everybody? Or is it just something that should go to the older and more vulnerable people? And the FDA has decided for now the latter. And I think that's the right decision for now. But we may get more data to show that it does help and maybe it is justified. And they need to look at safety, because we haven't really studied a 3rd booster dose to see if the minority harm that can be caused by a small number but can be potentially serious, whether that's increased. If it's increased in the 3rd dose than the 2nd dose, it might not make sense to give it to the young people at low risk who are still possibly strongly protected from their first 2. One thing that the data is very clear on is that the focus, the more important thing is getting the unvaccinated, not previously infected people vaccinated. That's way bigger benefit than topping off the protection for the vaccinated people. And by the way, another thing I didn't get into here, but the immunological studies, one of my colleagues, John Wary here at Penn, has done some studies on this, and others have. A lot of this waning immunity is driven by reduction of antibody levels, but the longer term protection that come from B cells that can regenerate antibodies, that has not declined at all. It actually increases at 6 months. So anyway, so yes, there is waning, but there's still evidence of substantial protection against infection. And there's even stronger remaining protection against hospitalizations. Okay, so one last point I'm going to make. I know I'm coming near the end. I want to talk a little bit about fact checking and information censoring during the pandemic. As we've all seen, fact checking has become a big thing over the last several years, especially now during the pandemic, because we see a lot of misinformation, a lot of partially true things, and even blatant falsehoods that get forwarded within certain networks of people that sort of have a group think going between them, and they see this same misinformation again and again and again and seems true to them. So fact checking has become an important way of trying to combat that misinformation. Similarly, on social media, they've tried to slow the proliferation of some of the misinformation by tagging some information as unreliable, and even censoring some things and kicking people off social media. I think this is a very tricky thing to do in a fluid situation like the pandemic. I can understand why they're doing it, and I'll kind of leave my personal concerns about censorship aside, but just to say that it's tricky because what we know to be true today may not be true next week. So I think we have to be very careful about censoring information too soon. And I think the problem is that the public misunderstands science as a repository of incontrovertible truths. Follow the science. When really, as we know, it's a gradually accruing of knowledge that can have many twists and turns, especially in a time like the pandemic. So there were certain expert claims earlier in the pandemic that if we did then what we do now, anything going against these would have been tagged, fact-checked, or even censored. But now we've learned they're true. So the lack of utility of masks in mitigating viral spread. Early on, it was suggested that masks don't do anything, but then we learned that they do help. And then now we've learned they help less. But again, that's one of those issues. One thing that I did a blog post on last July, it was very clear that there was aerosol spread, and environmental engineers could see it. There was a lot of evidence in the data, but it went against some of the infectious disease people's sort of dogma, where they said, no, there's no aerosol spread, it's not airborne. Because of that, they didn't take certain steps that they could have taken to improve ventilation and such, especially in schools, and do a lot of other things that could have helped because they would not acknowledge that. And that information would have been suppressed. And now finally in May, they've acknowledged that, yes, there is aerosol spread, ventilation is a major issue. It took them over a year. It took over a year for the CDC to acknowledge it. The World Health Organization, it took 6 or 8 months. There was a lot of data showing this. But again, this is something that would have been fact checked. And said, no, it's false that there's aerosol spread because experts say it's not. Also, I mentioned the risk of reinfection, the durability of immunity. This is something, again, that I disagree with. And even the natural origin of the virus versus lab accident. That's something that there's uncertainty about, but fact checkers may not acknowledge that. So the propagation of demonstrably false information online is a major problem. But the danger of interfering with open discourse and knowledge discovery is also a danger. So I think we have to be very careful with this issue. But if it's going to be done, we need to be involved to help the fact checkers understand the data and the degree of uncertainty so they don't consider things to be settled science that are not going to change when it's based on a lot of uncertainty in the data. So I think we need to be more heavily involved in this space. Okay, so in conclusion, I've given a lot of examples and talked about a lot of what I see the data saying recently in the pandemic, but a lot of it is comes from this idea that our statistical skill set is essential in understanding what the data say, and I think it's essential to society in navigating the pandemic. Evaluating bias, integrating data, adjusting for measurement error and informative missingness, adjusting for biases and confounders, and quantifying and communicating the degree of evidence and uncertainty of scientific results are all crucial. And I think we need to recognize the scarcity of our skill set. We take for granted our understanding of these things. Most people in society do not have these. Even some scientific leaders, some really smart media people, they still are not experts like we are about these quantitative nuances. So we need to make sure that collectively, we have a seat at the table with policy and decision makers to interpret the quantitative nuances. We need to be visible to media members so that they seek us out when there's quantitative nuances involved, that they don't automatically go to someone because they're an MD, but they recognize that if it's a data issue, an interpretation issue, that they should come to us. And so more of us need to be involved and visible and connected. And if there's going to be this fact checking and censoring and all this stuff, we need to be involved to make sure that their algorithms and their decisions properly account for uncertainty and bias. And so one person that is a junior faculty, but has been a major leader in our profession in doing this is Natalie Dean, who's now moved to Emory recently. She has over 100,000 Twitter followers and was named one of the top 50 experts to trust during the pandemic that I think has fueled a lot of her visibility, as well as her excellent work on experimental design and other things with vaccines. She's a true expert. And there was a review article that my colleague Susan Ellenberg and I wrote and published in Stats and Medicine, comparing this pandemic to the AIDS pandemic. And it was a discussion article. Natalie was one of the discussants and made this very, very poignant quote that I want to repeat here that I think hits the nail on the head. That we as statisticians are able to bring nuance and insight to an often oversimplified public discussion, where an out of context point estimate can turn into a headline and then a media frenzy. And this is exactly what I've seen happen again and again and again. And in our profession, if we get more involved, we can hopefully prevent that. So how can we get people more involved? It doesn't mean we all need to do this, but it means, especially those of us in leadership positions, need to think about how we incentivize our faculty and people in the workplace and in industry need to recognize that they're professionals should be getting involved in society as well, which can bring them visibility and impact to their company. So in academia, we need to define impact broadly, not just looking at papers and grants, but we need to look also at impact and reward biostatisticians for societally impactful work. And so all of these things are true during the pandemic. But even when this pandemic comes to a close, these same quantitative nuances affect our public understanding of all of the difficult, important scientific questions of our time and in other settings. So we need to continue to be involved. We need to continue to play this role. So I hope I've, kind of given you a sense of what we can do and hopefully inspired you to try and be more involved and to try and encourage others to be more involved in these societal questions. So I had never done any media stuff at all before the pandemic, but partly through this blog, I've gotten to do a lot now, and I've learned a lot through this. But one thing I can say is the media has a bad reputation, but almost everybody that I've been interviewed by and talked with seems very serious about understanding the truth. They're very open. They're not as biased as I expected. Sometimes the headlines, I think, end up coming out a certain way to get clicks, but there's a lot of incredible professionals in media, especially scientific media, that are really smart and trying to understand things and are very open to our input to help them see these nuances. So again, I think it's been a learning experience for me, but I think it showed me the impact that we can have, because if we can help the media people that we talk to understand these quantitative nuances in the story they're talking about, they can carry those to their future stories and hopefully help improve the scientific communication in the whole society. Okay, so thank you. And if we have time, I'm glad to take any questions.
I know we're a little over, but we do have a few questions in the chat. If you could refer to the chat.
Sure, let me see. Okay. Okay, let me see. So first one, so Daniel Chen. Hey, Dan. So do you know of any reports that either identify and or control collider variables, right? The exposure and the outcome independently causing a third variable. I've seen collider bias discussed a few times. I haven't really seen that accounted for. So it'd be interesting if you see any specific settings where you're really concerned. I think it's possible that maybe we should think more about that and recognize if there's some serious cases where that is causing us to misinterpret the data. It might be worth highlighting, but I haven't seen it. So next one, with total number vaccinated plus the total number of cases reported, likely underestimating the true case rate. That's right. Are we approaching herd immunity and thus the reason for the decline in case numbers over the past week? See, I think this is a tricky thing that I think the word herd immunity has become a loaded political term, and we might need to retire that term because it creates the wrong impression. Because I think people, it's become associated with the Great Barrington Declaration in the US, so it's become politicized. But it also, I think, is thought of in an oversimplified way by people that, there's a herd immunity threshold that you can derive based on the reproductive rate R0 of a virus, that technically when you get to that point, exponential spread can't be maintained anymore. But the thing is that we know that those static homogeneous epi models don't describe all the heterogeneity going on. So it is an oversimplification, and so people shouldn't think of herd immunity as a magic threshold that when you cross it, the virus goes away, but we should consider it as a continuous number. And the term I kind of prefer is population immune protection level. And so the proportion of people who have strong immune protection, which would be from vaccination or previous infection, and that number may decline a little bit as people lose some of their immune protection. That number is meaningful because those are people that when the virus encounters them, it can't spread to them. So what that effectively does is it's really a mitigating factor that shrinks the exponential growth. And so I think there is a threshold above which exponential growth can't really be sustained anymore. The problem is now that we have Delta dominating, that's 2.5 times more transmissible, that threshold is now close to 90%, which we're not close to. Well, maybe we are close to it because the UK does show high seropositivity. But the other thing about it is it's not a static thing also in terms of protection. Because you have immune protection doesn't mean you can't get infected to some degree. If you get exposed to a high viral load, you could still have a positive PCR test. You could still transmit to some people, even if your immune protection quickly neutralizes your infection within a couple of days instead of a couple of weeks. To make it completely go away, I think might be unrealistic. So anyway, I do think that this Delta surge has hit a lot more of the immune naive people, either with infection, more people have gotten vaccinated. So I think the pool of really susceptible people has gone down. And that does bring down the numbers, but also surges always have a natural peak and decline, and so it's hard to tell whether how much of this is the immune protection reaching a critical level, how much of it is a natural decline. I know we still have a lot of pockets of unvaccinated, not previously infected people in the country. So I think we're going to still be dealing with this as an endemic situation long term. Okay, so next question. Thank you for following this important area and debunking. Where is the longer lasting B cell immunity reference? So there's actually several references, but in some of my blog posts, I have it, but if you email me, I can send you the references. But there's a medRxiv paper by my colleague, John Wherry, Wherry. That's very recent. You might be able to Google and find it. Very strong results. And there's a couple other studies as well that show that. And I was happy to see that a couple other sort of big shots talking on social media have been talking about these papers and highlighting this issue. And I had kind of a cutesy little blog post about boosters, wondering aloud whether the boosters are really just like a Super Mario power-up. If all it's really doing is topping off our circulating antibody levels, making them really high for a short period of time, but not really affecting our long-term protection. Because one thing we see in the dynamics here, and this comes out of Wherry's paper as well as others, is these mRNA vaccines produce ridiculously high levels of neutralizing antibodies in our blood, like 10 times higher than infection. And that helps because if you're exposed at that time, your body doesn't even have to make the antibodies. They're just there in the blood, and they can get delivered more quickly and neutralize very quickly, even before you could even have an asymptomatic PCR test. But what happens is those circulating levels wane by 10-fold in 6 months. That's what the data shows. At that point, they're still high enough to be detectable. But if you're exposed, it's not enough to perhaps neutralize on its own. So the B cells and other parts of the immune system have to kick into action. That takes a few days. Those few days can be enough for a breakthrough infection to happen. So even if your immune system responds the right way it's supposed to and neutralizes it quickly, it might not be quick enough to prevent a case, especially in a world where we're doing contact tracing and lots of testing, and we're going to detect a lot of mild cases. So this might be part of what the breakthrough infections are. That's kind of what I think. But my cutesy little blog post tries to use the analogy of Super Mario power-ups, that it might just be giving us some extra juice to speed up our response, which may help. Maybe it's a good idea, but it might not really be giving us good long-term protection. And the question I asked there is, is this a realistic way for us to manage infectious disease? To try and permanently keep our circulating antibody levels insanely high, like indefinitely? Is that really the way we're going to manage this? I think it doesn't make sense immunologically. And so I'm kind of pointing that out in that blog post with that analogy. But anyway, so okay, so a couple more quick questions here. The standing up of the new CDC forecasting center headed by computational epidemiologists validates the needs for biostatisticians modeling. I totally agree. And I would love to see more efforts centralized within the government to pull together groups to collect the data in a complete way, which we're not doing a good job of in this country. And then also building teams that can rigorously analyze the data, that know the things we know. And we need to be involved in that along with the epidemiologists. Again, make sure we have a seat at the table there. So another question here. So how can we verify a trustworthy source for pandemic knowledge? That's a good question, because there's all kinds of information there. And what I say is I see stuff and like, I don't have time to follow everything. I still have a day job. This is only a part of that. The last month I've spent a lot more time on this, but I still have a group of 35 biostatistics faculty I'm leading, and I have a fully funded research program outside of this. So I'm trying, so I don't always have time to look into everything, but when I see something to tell whether it's reliable, it's hard. And I think we don't want to, judge too quickly. But what I quickly do is I see what they're saying and I try and see what data do they have, what study do they have, and is this reliable? I always try and go to the data and see what is supporting it. And I think it's not just sort of the people spreading misinformation or deniers that are saying sloppy things. I think some scientific leaders are sometimes being a little bit sloppy. And I gave a couple examples of that, where they're quick to dismiss certain things and argue against certain things. But if you look at the data, some of those things might be true. They might not be convenient truths, but if they're true, we need to acknowledge them, because if we ignore them, then that's just going to arm the people on the other side spreading the information, because it's going to make the scientific community look like it is suppressing information. And we need to be very careful to guard our integrity and our credibility as objective data scientists in this. So what are some independent common sense verification procedures? Well, that's a good question. I don't know that I have thought about that, but one thing that's a red flag is anytime anyone just talks about the proportion of such and such that are vaccinated or the number that are vaccinated, the Simpsons paradox posts, I've done a couple others as well, really show how misleading those are. So that's always a red flag. And you need to look out for certain things, like the time confounding that I mentioned is really important, because if you look at summaries that are computed over a really long period of time, like over all of 2021, you can't really trust those numbers. They're going to be skewed. So I think the key thing is, if people are trying to make broad conclusions about causal things like what the vaccine is doing, I want to see the data, the modeling. I want to see whether they're using a match design or some other rigorous design. And I want to see how they're adjusting for the confounders, because if they're not doing that, the results might be unreliable. So that's kind of one of the key things I look at there. But yeah, sorry, I don't have a real clean answer to that. So 3 others, I'll try and be quick here, or 2 others. Okay, that's just a thank you and a link to the blog. Okay, so that's it. So if anyone has any other questions, yeah, I'm glad to take them. I know we're over time by actually quite a bit, so sorry about that. But thank you for hanging in there with me as I go on and on about this stuff.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay. Well, Dr. Morris, I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today and give us that seminar. It's been really informative, and I'm already receiving a lot of positive feedback. So we truly appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Thank
Well, thanks
you
for the
so
invitation.
much.
Sure. And again, I'm sad I couldn't be there and meet you in person, but maybe there'll be another day I can come down and visit when things are in a little better place. But thank
We
you
would
again.
love that.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Yep.